Awesome. All right, well, it's going great. That's how it's going. So we're going to take a journey. We're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about site reliability. We're going to talk about serverless. What's one of the hardest problems in computer science? Off by one errors. We're going to talk about serverless. We're going to talk about FinDevOps. We're going to talk about DevOps. So anyways, real quick, proof that the right person's up on the stage. That's all you need to know. I worked at a lot of different places. Last time I was in Houston, I was talking to people at Compaq. It was a good time. So I'm glad that people are still representing. That was an interesting time. I did work at HP, and oh my God, what happened? Anyway, so now I'm a recovering application security person. I used to do AppSec for a long time, about 20 years. I was last at a company called Veracode, and I decided that the cloud was kind of more interesting than anything else out there, and so I decided to focus on that. So this is the journey that I'm going to take you on today. We're going to talk about serverless. We're going to talk about reliability. We're going to talk about how serverless changes things. We're going to talk about something new called FinDevOps, which is just to get us to have the conversation. And then we'll talk about the future. I don't expect everyone to necessarily agree or even think any of this stuff sounds remotely sane. In fact, if you think anything that I say today is crazy, I would love to talk to you about that because we're all kind of learning as we go along here. But anyways, so the more crazy you think it is, the faster you should come over and chat with me after the talk. All right, so what is serverless? How many people have heard about serverless before, playing around with it today? Right? So a lot of what we're doing in DevOps is about how fast can we get the value to the customer. That's really all that serverless is. People have been talking about its functions, it's this technology, that technology. It's just a technology abstraction on top of a lot of different capabilities that a lot of different cloud providers are very rapidly working on. But the main goal is how can we get the business value faster. How can we deliver the business value faster, right? Get it to our customers. Now, I'm going to keep on pressing the wrong button. All right, there we go. Now, if we wanted to get a little bit deeper than just that high-level definition, I'll give you this. So I often like to talk to people and tell them that serverless is actually a spectrum. You can think of it as an operational model. You can think of it as a set of technologies. The stuff the farthest on the right-hand side is the least serverless. And this is the Amazon edition. There's an Azure edition of this and a Google edition of this. Stuff on the farthest right has the most operational overhead and is the least serverless. The stuff on the left is the most serverless, right? And when we think about serverless, it's important to realize that it wasn't just started with AWS Lambda or Google Cloud Functions or anything like that. It was actually started when Amazon first launched some of their first services. How many people know what Amazon's first service launched to the world was? It's SQS, actually. And then S3, and then EC2. And then we all got confused for 10 years. And then we came back and realized that it was about letting the cloud provider manage stuff for us, right? And if you don't like that, don't. Keep your servers, right? Anyways, so wrap it all together. I like to think of the cloud as an operating system and that serverless is its native code. And this is what we should all aspire to do because it's the fastest path to business value. So we have a problem, though. A lot of us lifted and shifted our way into the cloud. We took the servers out of the basement, put them on a forklift, we sent them into the cloud. Everything worked great, sort of. There is no lifting and shifting into the serverless world. Right? It is really a rethink in terms of how you've built your systems, how you built your processes. And because you can't do this, it really implies that your culture as well has to change. And I like to think of DevOps as a culture, and that's why we're going to talk a little bit about how that culture changes. Now, of course, we're all here because we want to build reliable systems. So how does that change? How do we build reliable systems if we're building serverless systems versus what we're doing today? Well, we know this, so the pretty somewhat famous CTO regularly says this whenever he gets up on the stage. He says, everything fails all the time. How many people, if your CTO or CIO came to the next meeting and said, hey, everything that we're building, everything that we're delivering to our customers is going to fail. It's going to fail all the time, and they're going to love it, right? They might not be the most popular person in the room. But that's literally what happened, and that's why lift and shift was so painful for many of us, is that we lifted and shifted the things that we could reliably run in our data center but could no longer reliably run in the cloud because we had to change how we were doing deployments, change how we scale, change how we manage that infrastructure. And that's the reality of operating in the cloud. Everything fails all the time. And so if we get even more native in this world, what does reliability even mean if everything is failing all the time? And so I spent a lot of time trying to think about what does reliability mean in this constant failure world that we all enjoy living in. And you could go to Wikipedia and look up the definition. But I got back to the point of view around value, what we're trying to do for the customer. And I came up with this definition, that reliability is the trustworthiness of a system's ability to delight the customer. The first talk was talking about that. I loved it this morning. Data center could be on fire. Customer doesn't care. You're using Kubernetes or you're using something else, customer doesn't care. How you're going about doing it, customer doesn't care. Am I delighting the customer at the end of the day? And I think we need to think about reliability in that same point of view as well. But there's another dimension that I'll talk about in a moment that needs to feed into how we define reliability. So what are the forces for us today that allow us to kind of conjure up reliability or drive reliability in organizations? And I think there's two pieces to that. There's DevOps, which I really think of as more of a culture that's made up of things like, let's break down those silos, let's increase our feature velocity, let's measure everything. And then we have a practice, which has actually been around longer than DevOps, called site reliability engineering, which is made up of a number of things that we do on a daily basis or as part of our process to make sure that we're building reliable systems. Think about availability, we think about monitoring, change management, et cetera, et cetera. So since this is a talk about serverless, how does serverless change those things? How does it change the process and how does it change the culture? So here's the areas that I'm going to talk the most about, these 4 items here. I'm going to talk about availability, about how availability really changes to cloud SLAs and auto-scaling. Efficiency, we start talking about cost. Monitoring, we start talking about observability. We already chatted earlier about observability. I thought that was a great conversation. And when we talk about capacity planning, we actually need to start thinking about service limit planning. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But a lot of these things just become either harder or still your problem. They don't change much, but these 4 items do change a lot. So availability, right? So the secret to happiness, of course, is letting go. If you're in the cloud, you've got to let go. The more you give to your cloud provider, the more you put in their hands, hopefully they'll earn that trust, right? But you've got to let it go. Let go of the servers, let them float away, and you'll be happy. Well, mostly happy. Instead of thinking about efficiency, how efficient are my systems running, we need to actually now start thinking about cost. Now, a lot of people say serverless is so dirt cheap, why would you care, right? Well, it's because serverless isn't functions. It's the whole system. Everything in this diagram, 100% serverless. DynamoDB, Lambda's in there, API Gateway, S3, CloudWatch logs. I've seen, I don't know how many AWS systems built out, and the number one cost in those serverless systems is actually CloudWatch logs, right? It's all part of the same system. So fast is not serverless. We have to think about the entire system. And it's not free. It's definitely not free. Monitoring needs to move from looking at the logs to observability. Now, what is observability, really? You know, we talked about that earlier. I think the definition is around the same thing. It really comes down to what's your ability to observe and understand what the system's doing as a function of its outputs, right? And you have to be able to do that without a priori knowledge. So have you built the correct parts of your system in place so that after it fails, you actually can understand what happened? Not before, right? Because you're never going to know. And there's a lot of other ways you can get at that problem, but dumping all your logs are not going to solve the problem. Building dashboards are not going to solve that problem. Emergent properties are going to be legion. You can absolutely not count on being able to test for everything. Testing in production really, it's the only way to go. And of course, this isn't analysis either, right? So getting all that data into a bunch of dashboards and staring deeply, intently into them, and that is the most disturbing photo that you can find for eyeballing something. Google image search is a dangerous, dangerous thing. That's not analysis, right? All right, capacity planning. We need to think about service limits. So capacity is built in. Everyone in this room makes a buying decision when they write a line of code. You want 100 servers, you want 1,000 servers. The engineers, the developers, they're the ones making the buying decisions today. So you've got all the capacity you could want, but the systems themselves have limits, and serverless systems are no exception. In fact, there's more limits, and a lot of times it's harder to find them. On Lambda, you might know about the concurrent execution limit. That's changeable. There's another limit, though, about how fast that concurrency can spin up, and that's not necessarily changeable, and it's different from region to region. API Gateway has certain limitations on how long a transaction can hang open. You can't really change that, right? Max payload size, you can't really change that. And then there's all the patterns in terms of how you link things together. S3 can asynchronously call Lambda. Lambda pulls DynamoDB streams if you have shards. How do I even know how many shards my DynamoDB table is running? It's all opaque, I don't know, right? So we have to spend some time thinking about the limits and not just about the capacity that's available to us. All right, so then how does serverless affect DevOps culture? This is where it's going to get a little maybe touchy. I'm going to talk about these two things because I think at the end of the day, culture really drives everything, right? So we got to stop faking DevOps. If you see an ops team, you blew it. You really did. I'm sorry. That's my personal belief. I think that dev and ops, it wasn't a merger. It was a hostile takeover. How did we get into this business in the first place? It's because we wanted to get value out to the customer faster. We all live that same life where we throw something over the wall. The example that was given this morning was perfect. Sneak into the server room, get it deployed, and sneak out before the ops people know, right? We got to stop faking DevOps. It's not that there's multiple teams, it's one team. If you build it, you own it. The effect that serverless brings to the party is that there's no faking it anymore. Configuration is absolutely code. The entire system is absolutely code. You build it. There is no clicking around in the Amazon console to build an effective serverless system. You can't fake your way through it. And at the end of the day, the only people who are going to understand it are the people who built it. Now that might be a little bit frightening, but it's also pretty empowering because we can get that much faster in terms of delivering value to our customers. The other piece here is that who cares about failure, right? Remember, everything's failing all the time. It's going to fail a lot. All that matters is what is your mean time to recovery before it fails, right? If you're 5 minutes away from production at any given moment, if you make a change, doesn't work, you roll back, did anybody know? This is really fine. Everything fails all the time, and that's okay if you're really good at pushing out the changes and recovering. And that should be the item that you should be focused on the most. And it's all built in code. Think about it like this. It's 6 p.m., it's a Friday, and you've got some code you've been working on all day long. Is it time to deploy? How many people would push that deploy button? How many people would push it? That guy right there? I would push that button every time with you. If you can't push that button at 6 p.m. on Friday, I will challenge everyone here in this room. If you can't push that button on 6 p.m. on Friday, then you don't truly understand your systems. You don't truly understand your process. You don't truly have faith in what you've built. If you love it, you got to let it go. You got to have faith in your team. I mean, the point of view the point I'm making here is if you don't feel comfortable pushing that button, then there's something wrong in your organization, there's something wrong in the culture, there's something wrong in the process, and you should make that a open dialogue amongst your teammates so that you can go figure out why that is, right? Because ultimately, if you can bring yourself to a point where you can deploy at 6 p.m. on Friday, then you have probably the best DevOps team on the planet, right? I absolutely guarantee you that statement is absolutely true. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about cost. It's time we had that talk. So all this stuff isn't free, right? It's all running in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud or somewhere else. So while we were all reading the marketing brochure, everyone was talking about infinite scale, auto-scaling, the ability to scale up in a heartbeat, handle any customer load. Did they give all that to us for free? No. If you have infinite scale, it follows that you must have infinite wallet, right? How many people have an infinite wallet? If anybody raised their hand, I would just run out the door with you right now. We're heading straight to wherever, all right? You have to ask yourself, in the systems that we're building today in the cloud, at what point are we going to degrade our customer experience to save the wallet, right? Prior to serverless, even really prior to cloud, we had constraints as engineers and as people who built systems. The CFO and the CIO and the CEO got into a room, they went and they talked about what they were going to buy for the year. They amortized it over 3 years. They spent a couple $1 million. That was your constraint. You had the amount of CPU and disk and memory that they bought on those systems, and you never thought about it. You lived within that box, right? Now we operate in an environment where all those things are completely dynamic, right? And what are we doing? We're scaling up like crazy. But at what point are we going to degrade the customer experience to save the wallet, right? Because a system that puts your company out of business is not a reliable system. You will not delight your customer if they love your product and then you go out of business. We never had to make that decision before. We never had to think about that before. And that's the world that is very rapidly approaching us. As you start to build serverless systems, you will find that out the hard way very, very, very fast. You may have already figured it out just building EC2 and autoscaling. So thinking about cost and architecture for a second, let's come back to this chart, right? How many people would even be able to know that this was happening, right? You probably know if it failed. You probably know if the customer was down. You'd know that something wasn't working. But if it was costing you some ridiculous sum of money, how long would it be before you found out about that? It'd probably be a week or maybe a month or maybe a quarter before the CFO comes down to your desk and says, what's up? Why did we just spend $100,000 on something called CloudWatch Logs? How many people want to explain what CloudWatch Logs is to their CFO, right? So how long will it take you to know, right? And that's a big part of the problem. Because we haven't thought about cost when we think about the metrics and the things that we're monitoring and our process for building reliable systems. So cost in this future world must become a first-class metric, right? If we're going to build effective cloud-based systems using native code like serverless, it has to be a first-class metric. Now, what is a first-class metric? So I think a first-class metric is basically what we'd expect from the metrics today that we use to monitor the systems that we're monitoring now, right? It's real time. We get a page the second something is going down. Not when it costs too much, unfortunately. It has context. You can measure it. And you have a clear definition of good and bad, right? This is what I mean when I say cost must become a first-class metric. And so what I think is changing is that we start to embrace a different way of thinking about the systems that we're building. And we start to move from a culture called DevOps to a new tribe, a culture where cost becomes part of that conversation. And maybe this terminology disappears and we just continue to call it DevOps. I'd be absolutely 100% fine with that. But it means that cost becomes a first-class operational metric. And Simon Wardley, if you've ever heard him give any of his talks, he talks about mapping. It's really quite amazing. He talks about how financial development and operations practices need to come together. He was the first one to suggest it. And that, let's just all agree, there is a tight correlation between a cost-effective system and a well-architected one. All right, so last part here, the future. So I think it's absolutely, without a doubt, going to happen that cost is going to become a first-class metric. It has to be on top of mind when we're monitoring, managing, building these systems. We should all start viewing our cloud systems as if they are an investment, right? Not just a cost, actually, but an investment. If I spend $1,000 or $100,000 or $1 million on my cloud bill, am I getting at least that in the return on that investment? Right? That's how we should feel about this spend. How many people saw the $100 million cloud bill that Lyft talked about when they did their S1 filing? Right? Heard about that? Do you know what that accounts to? You know, it sounds like a lot of money, right? It's 14 cents a ride. It's not a lot of money. It's not a lot of money at all. In fact, it's actually pretty darn cheap. But that's what happens when you see the total cost of all of your IT operations in one big fat number. Today, it's all spread out all over the place. But we need to think about it in terms of investment and what the return on that investment is. And serverless is a technology that I think is going to get us there. This is ultimately where I think we'll end up. We'll start thinking about things like gross margins and COGS. Kind of boring. But those are pretty cool metrics, and we're a metrics-driven community. And FinDevOps is going to make that possible, right? And we'll come back to this chart. Well, who cares? We're rich, right? Maybe I'm spending a lot of money writing a bunch of stuff to logs. And by the way, any one of us could have made that mistake. You changed info logs to debug logs, and now you're generating gigabytes instead of megabytes of data into CloudWatch. And so we could make this system be even more cost effective, but who cares? At the end of the day, every time we have a client come to our site, we're making money, we're building a reliable system, and we're not putting our company out of business. That's the future that I see for us. And that's it. Thank you very much.